Here we are for the second part of Chapter 6, looking at blood. So, in Part A, we talked about red blood cells, and now we're going to talk about white blood cells, remember leukocytes, structure and function. So, white blood cells structurally are larger than red blood cells. They're quite a bit bigger. They are less numerous. We don't have nearly as many of them. But they do have a nucleus, and we can actually see that in our images here on the right. Whenever we see a cell, that purple blob in the middle, whether it's lobed or, kind of round like what we typically have seen in our previous pictures, we still have a nucleus present. They do lack hemoglobin, and that's why they're white blood cells, is because under the microscope they basically have no color unless we stain them, versus the red blood cells are red because hemoglobin is red when oxygen is bound to it. So we don't have hemoglobin, but we do have a nucleus. We have some other organelles. We're bigger, but there aren't as many of us. So white blood cells, that's what they are structurally. Functionally, if we jump down a little bit, they are fighting infection. That is their entire purpose. There are 5 types, which we'll look at on the next slide, but as a whole, what they're all doing is trying to fight pathogens. And in order to do that, they need to be able to leave the blood. The blood is a fabulous, essentially, highway system of getting through the body, but sometimes, in order to fight a pathogen, you need to leave the highway and you need to get into a house or into a cell. And so the white blood cells are what I call the sneaky teenager, and they actually are able, this is what we're seeing here, this is what we call diapedesis, is this process, and they can actually totally basically squish themselves into this through a skinny little crack in the capillary and leave into the tissue. And then once they're in the tissue, they follow chemical signals to reach where an infection might be occurring. So red blood cells are never going to do this. It has no benefit, but with white blood cells, they can totally pull a sneaky teenager, sneak through the cracks, and then move to where they need to go. So because of that, when they do that, that's what we call interstitial fluid. When they sneak out of that capillary, they're entering the interstitial fluid. In addition to that, some of them will get sucked back up by a lymphatic capillary, and then they'll be in the lymph. So we can find white blood cells just about anywhere in the body. Lifespan of white blood cells, remember for red blood cells it was 120 days. For white blood cells it's a much broader option. When you have an infection, some of them may only last a couple of days, but others will last for months or even years, especially when they are memory cells. We're going to see a lot more of this in a few chapters when we talk about the immune system. So for right now, we're just going to remember that they can live a lot longer than red blood cells. And again, fighting infection. So the 5 types of white blood cells are neutrophils, eosinophils, basophils, lymphocytes, and monocytes. And they're basically named after how they stain and what their nucleus looks like under the microscope. So you don't have to worry a whole lot about the names other than just knowing them. What we're interested in are their functions. Neutrophils are just a generic phagocyte. If they see something that's foreign, they're going to bind to it, they're going to phagocytize it, and they're going to break it down. That's what they do regardless of what the pathogen is. Eosinophils are very specifically trying to digest very large pathogens such as worms, like a tapeworm that might be living in your body. So it's actually going to secrete a whole lot of digestive enzymes to try to break down the worm from the outside in. A basophil is a cell that releases chemicals in order to promote blood flow to an injured area or where you have an infection. So it's going to promote inflammation. And even though inflammation might make it a little sore for you and I on the outside of the body or in the inside, it's really beneficial because it's bringing more blood, more oxygen, more nutrients, more white blood cells to that area to fight the pathogen and then heal an injured tissue. You have lymphocytes, which are going to be B cells and T cells, and they're going to provide very specific immunity for the body against viruses and bacteria. And then monocytes are, again, another sort of generic phagocyte, another generic cell that does phagocytosis of pathogens, just like the neutrophils. The monocytes and the neutrophils kind of change when each one will be attacking, and again, more coming in the immune system. For right now, this is just a summary of those 5 types and their functions. So white blood cells aren't always perfect, just like red blood cells are not always perfect, and we can have some disorders of the leukocytes. So severe combined immunodeficiency disease, also known as SCID, is an inherited disease. It is genetic, and what happens here is that the white blood cell stem cells lack an enzyme that allows them to fight infection. So you have white blood cells, but they're not actually able to perform their function. And so that's why we call it an immunodeficiency disease. You are lacking the immune system because you're lacking the enzyme in the white blood cells. There are other types of immunodeficiency diseases, like HIV and some others, but this is one that's a little more well known. I suppose HIV is well known too. Leukemia is another white blood cell disorder. This is a cancer of the white blood cells. So here we have white blood cells proliferating uncontrollably. And the problem is that they're not actually functioning as white blood cells. They're not actually performing a useful function in killing pathogens. They're, I guess, a mutated white blood cell. And the leukemia types are just named based on which type of white blood cell is cancerous. And then infectious mononucleosis, also known as mono, occurs when a virus infects your lymphocytes. And so that virus has infected your lymphocytes, which fight disease, of course, but because they themselves are infected, they can't actually fight off the virus. So you're very tired, you have a sore throat, you have swollen lymph nodes, and it just takes your body a really long time to overcome mono. All right, so our third type of formed element, we said, were platelets. And platelets, again, are those fragments of cells coming out of the red bone marrow. And your body makes about 200 billion platelets every day because they really don't last very long. So we just constantly produce more. The whole function of platelets, as far as we know, is just blood clotting. And it's going to work with thrombin and fibrinogen to make that happen. But platelets should just automatically in your mind be associated with blood clotting. So how do platelets actually help clot your blood? I do want you to know all the steps of the blood clot, partly because it's useful and partly because it's really cool. And so we want to just take some time to learn how this happens, particularly because then when we know someone with a disorder of a platelet, we know what's going on. So first of all, what has to happen is your blood vessel is punctured. So in this case, we have a knife. So this is maybe a blood vessel in the hand, but it could also be, more internal. For whatever reason, we now have a hole in the blood vessel, and blood is going to start seeping through. Plasma and platelets and ions are going to start leaving the hole and just entering the body's cavities, which is no bueno. So we need to obviously create some sort of plug for this big gaping hole. So your platelets are very, very smooth most of the time, and the inside of your blood vessel wall is actually incredibly smooth, but as soon as that layer is gone, there's these little fibers here sticking out, and it makes it really, really sticky. And so it sticks to the platelets, and the platelets all stick to each other, and they form a plug. Now, when the platelets are in the process of plugging and in the process of getting stuck, they release something called prothrombin activator. And so just think about the name. Prothrombin activator must activate prothrombin, and that's exactly what it does. It is a molecule that turns prothrombin, it activates it into thrombin. Thrombin's just the activated form. I'll do a little circle here. The activated form of prothrombin. So let's just say that again. Prothrombin activator, as its name implies, activates prothrombin into thrombin. Then thrombin, as we see on the left, says initiates a cascade of enzymatic reactions. And that's true, but we can just learn one more step. So thrombin turns fibrinogen. Remember that we saw that as a plasma protein earlier? Thrombin turns fibrinogen into fibrin threads. So fibrin threads are really what's going to help solidify this plug that we've created. We see them here as these long, white, stringy things, and we see them in this image as this dark blue sort of net inside here. And fibrin threads are able to be very long, and they can trap red blood cells. And because red blood cells are so much more substantial than a platelet, they actually cause this really nice cap to form over that plug that you initially created with the platelets. And now we have a clot. We have a blood clot. And this time it's a beneficial blood clot because we're preventing internal bleeding or external bleeding. So to review, platelets, plug. Prothrombin activator turns prothrombin into thrombin. Thrombin can then turn fibrinogen, which has always been in your blood, but just inactivated, and it can stitch it all together to form fibrin threads, which can then trap the red blood cells, and now we have a big, nice blood clot. Essentially, what goes on to break it down is that there's also little molecules. You don't have to necessarily know this, but for those of you who are like, okay, wait, but what it's not going to be there forever. It's little molecules stuck in the clot, and after a while they start breaking away the fibrin threads once the capillary has healed. Okay, so just like with red blood cells and white blood cells, platelets can also have disorders. If you have a low number of platelets in your body for any reason, that will mean that your blood can't correctly clot, and that's going to make you a lot more prone to bleeding and bruising. Of course, if a clot breaks off, it will become an embolus, even if it was initially a beneficial clot. And if it plugs another vessel, then that could be a thromboembolism. Like we said, that could be a stroke or a heart attack. We mentioned that in chapter 5. So we do need to make sure our body is breaking down those clots as soon as they can. And hemophilia is a deficiency in a clotting factor. So think back to when we said there was a cascade of enzymatic reactions. Clotting factors are involved in order to make thrombin and fibrinogen work properly. And hemophilia, there's many types, but if one of those clotting factors doesn't work or is lacking, then that whole chain of events doesn't work, and the fibrin threads are never made and the clot is never completed. And so the body's unable to properly clot. And as a result, of course, we would be concerned about excess bleeding and bruising and internal bleeding.